A prisoner transport bus arrives back at the Portland ICE facility, bringing with it a new crop of civilians whose only crime was, allegedly, crossing an imaginary line without the approval of some distant bureaucracy. Across the street, the arrival is met with an outburst of cries and boos from a crowd nearby. Organized in protest of ICE's horrific actions, the protesters nevertheless allow the van to deliver its human cargo unimpeded. The lives of those inside irrevocably altered. Denunciations now complete, they promptly return to their demonstrative yoga party, more determined than ever to stop ICE at any cost. How did we get here? Just a month before, on October 18th, a second wave of No Kings protests swept across every major city in the United States, as well as many outside the USA, proving that the anger that animated the earlier protests in July have not dissipated. If anything, they've grown stronger. Early estimates made by the movement's organizers suggest upwards of 7 million people took to the streets to protest President Trump's authoritarian agenda. If accurate, this would make this the biggest demonstration in American history, beating out the previous record, also set by No Kings in July. Organizers have already begun to plan their next steps, meaning No Kings might break its own record again. If ever the time was right for American liberals to mount a counteroffensive, it would be now. And yet they're doing no such thing. After feigning the courage to fight long enough to secure a series of small electoral victories on November 4th, Senate Democrats agreed to end this year's government shutdown and approve the Republican federal funding plan despite securing no significant concessions. Victories rarely come quickly, but it is difficult to see how, even in theory, this course of action could possibly produce any. Of course, mass movements are not responsible for the failures of elected politicians, except insofar as those movements stand for nothing more than to support them. No Kings arguably falls short of even that pitiful mandate, declaring its purpose to be nothing more than to defend democratic norms and reject authoritarianism. Though the largest, No Kings is but the latest in a long series of movements since Trump's first election that have all failed in precisely the same way. Most notably, the movement whose attendance record No Kings broke in July, the 2017 Women's March, was also held in opposition to Donald Trump. There's no reason to think No Kings will succeed where the Women's March failed simply by setting an even more impressive record. The very success of these movements underlines their futility. They've succeeded wildly on their own terms, and they've accomplished nothing. The futility of this exercise does not diminish the potential they represent, a fact conservatives registered clearly. In the days preceding the protest, conservative media stoked fears of impending chaos and political violence, as well as speculated about who might be behind the movement, despite its organizers being a matter of unambiguous public record. As U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said in an October 15 interview with Spotlight on Maryland, "I am concerned about who is funding this, who is paying for it, who is organizing it." Duffy also invoked the classic trope of outside agitators infiltrating and participating in the protests, a favorite tactic to delegitimize protests that exceed the bounds set for them by the very powers being protested. That is to say, protests that directly challenge power. In this same vein of delegitimation, President Trump asserted that No Kings had somehow been very small, very ineffective, and that the people were whacked out. Moreover, despite a new Harvard study revealing No Kings was the most geographically widespread protest in American history, Trump asserted that the protesters are not representative of this country. It should be well understood by now that such inconvenient facts are entirely besides the point. Trump and his ilk decided No Kings was illegitimate before it ever happened, and they assert whatever falsehoods would need to be true in order for their assessment to be valid. In a world of alternative truths, the concept of inconvenient facts ceases to apply. That Trump can so easily neutralize the power of inconvenient facts, however, does nothing to negate their reality, and his attitude towards them can be instructive. The bourgeois survival instinct should not be underestimated. And when reactionaries respond to something with fear, radicals should take note. For all their bluster to the contrary, that the entire conservative media sphere was marshaled to discredit No Kings proves they are frightened, and whatever frightens reactionaries ought to intrigue us. If we should be intrigued by the potential threat conservatives feel No Kings poses, we should be equally intrigued by its complete failure to actualize that threat. Why fear a movement that has done nothing frightening, that follows in the footsteps of a long series of movements which have done nothing frightening? Certainly, there is a reason for their fear, but it has nothing to do with No Kings itself. On the contrary, No Kings is, in some respects, the only thing standing between conservatives and that which they truly fear, the self-activity of the working class and the marginalized. In their own way, liberal professional activists fear it as much, if not more, than do conservatives. The name No King itself is a testament to the fatal temperance at the heart of the organizers' political vision. Surely, Hillary Clinton's claim in her endorsement of the movement that "we don't do monarchs here" is agreeable enough to almost anyone, and so avoids the risk of alienating potential allies, but it also reduces the movement to standing for nearly nothing. It is so inoffensive that even Trump's supporters can agree to it. As Sean Duffy said in his earlier quoted interview, "We don't have a king. We had an election, and Donald Trump crushed the election and won." Any movement whose name even its enemies can agree to is one whose aims are too confused to be effective. Though confused, the name of No Kings was a deliberate choice by the movement's organizers and expresses a very particular view of what Trump represents. Liberals have their own ways of dealing with inconvenient facts. In this case, the fact that Trump is a product of the very system whose norms they wish to defend. Such norms are, of course, vastly preferable to their alternative, but the very existence of fascism suggests such norms are inadequate. For the organizers of No Kings and their allies in the Democratic Party, Trump's fascism is nothing more than a passing aberration that, once defeated, will fade away, allowing the old status quo to return as though it never left. This belief, always false, is flatly nonsensical in 2025. Aberrations are not elected twice, and yet Donald Trump was not only re-elected to a second term, but awarded his second term after once losing to a status quo candidate, Joe Biden. Moreover, Donald Trump's presidency comes amidst a decade-long global rise in fascism, making him a supposedly international aberration. There is nothing to be concluded from this other than that the status quo has failed and that fascism has emerged from that failure. To hope that to defeat fascism from the very premises that produced it is an absurdity that has failed every time it has been tried. No Kings will fail because it is a movement whose only political vision is the intentional abdication of political vision, an explicit disavowal of all who would ask it to stand for something more. When protesters began to raise signs decrying the United States' support of Israel's genocide of Palestine, many were turned away or even yelled at by No Kings activists who considered such sentiments not relevant or even a bad look for the movement. Most absurdly, Democrats Abroad, the Democratic Party's organization for U.S. citizens living abroad, rebranded the movement to No Tyrants, so as to not mix messages in a country with a monarchy. When a movement cannot even stick to its own name, what message is there left to get mixed? No Kings has adopted in its fight against Donald Trump the very strategy the Democrats lost to him with in the first place, seemingly having learned nothing from the experience. If anything, Kamala Harris's recent and already infamous book tour demonstrates that many top Democrats have not only learned nothing, but oppose learning on principle. When confronted by protesters about her refusal to separate herself from the Biden administration's support for Zionism, Harris's only response was to blame pro-Palestine voters for not swallowing their principles and voting for her to avoid Trump's even more extreme support of Israel. Quote, "Don't come at me with that. I'm not president, and if you want to talk about legacy, let's talk about the legacy of people not voting and Donald Trump." In other words, Democrats cannot fail voters. Voters can only fail Democrats. If this conclusion is absurd, the reasoning behind it is nevertheless straightforward. The Democrats, no matter how many ethical compromises they may make, are morally preferable to the Republican alternative. Within this logic, not only are the Democrats free to abandon principle at will, they are incentivized to. If Democrats are owed support from left-wing voters, why cater to them? What's crucial is to reach out and win over voters who do not owe the Democrat support, those for whom Democrats and Republicans are equivalents. Any policies that might alienate these mythical moderates are anathema. The reasoning is intuitive, but easily demonstrated to be false. If the key to electoral success is found in not alienating moderates, the career of Donald Trump is inexplicable. Though a multi-billionaire, Trump has successfully positioned himself as an outsider through his iconoclasm. Not only does he make no apologies for his evil, he clearly enjoys antagonizing others in the process. If moderation is the pathway to victory, Trump never should have been nominated, let alone elected twice. Some, perhaps most notably cognitive linguist George Lakoff, have sounded the alarm on the failures of this strategy for decades to no avail, perhaps suggesting the Democrats have ulterior motives to clinging to a failed strategy. The question is why a grassroots movement like No Kings would willingly duplicate it. Is there any reason to think so impotent an electoral strategy will succeed when applied to grassroots activism? Certainly not. There's every reason to think it is less effective, since elections at least possess a mechanism of directly affecting change. By what means does No Kings hope to realize its ends? Applied to activism, the strategy of moderation is the pragmatic equivalent to no strategy at all. It valorizes popularity for its own sake, missing that in electoral politics, popularity translates to power. This is not so with protest, as No Kings itself demonstrates clearly. At most, No Kings will funnel support into the Democratic Party, something Democrats themselves have recognized, hence their shift from tentative distance in June to overt support in October. Even if this leads to the Democrats' success in midterm elections, they will do nothing to resolve the failures of society writ large that generates fascism in the first place. History repeats itself. First as tragedy, then as farce, ad infinitum. The failure of No Kings challenges the Enlightenment prejudice that knowledge is power, the liberal prejudice that its demonstration alone constitutes a threat. Millions of Americans recognize the enormity of the danger posed by the Trump administration, understand its fascistic character, and have taken to the streets to express their opposition to it. It persists. Liberal activism has long hinged on the assumption that what stands in the way of social change is ignorance, stubbornly denying that many people simply do not share our values. Even as they apply the label fascist, liberals refuse to accept that Trump and his supporters are enemies. If this refusal necessarily leads liberals to defeat, we should nevertheless not be too quick in considering it a mistake, as it is a mistake every generation of liberals confronted with the threat of fascism has made. It is an endemic failure of the liberal worldview to accord with reality, a consequence of its fundamental beliefs about the nature of class society. To see fascism for what it is, and treat it accordingly, would require liberals to see past the superficial harmony of a society built on exploitation and marginalization, to see that capitalist society itself is latent with the fascist threat they wish to oppose. In other words, to confront fascism would require liberals to confront themselves, to cease to be liberals. Does it follow that No Kings is a waste of time? Certainly not. Trump and his supporters have good reason to fear it as they do. If the movement can transcend its self-imposed limitations, there's every reason to think this could prove a pivotal moment in the development of American politics. However, there's no reason to think the No Kings organizers will spontaneously transcend these limitations of their own accord, seeing as they're the ones imposing them. The question becomes how the energy behind No Kings might be funneled into something more productive, the independent self-activity of the working class. Though the difficulty of this task is apparent, so too is its necessity. As the rise of fascism itself demonstrates, capitalist society and its corresponding liberal ideology have passed their expiration date, and there's no turning back the clock. The center cannot hold. There is no path forward for anti-fascism that does not go beyond anti-fascism, that does not break from bourgeois politics entirely and directly challenge the social basis of fascism, the fundamental miseries of capitalist society that liberalism is helpless to redress. Only an organized proletariat, united behind a boldly partisan vision of class politics, can overcome the barriers No Kings faces and channel it into something more than an elaborate moral parade. If we don't try, we do just as well joining the yoga party. What, aside from tactical frivolity, separates the two.